Would you like to grow a year's worth of onions? Maybe the key in doing that is to break some of the rules. Growing a year's worth of onions has been a moving target for me over the last 10 years, as long as I've been gardening. And growing onions themselves has probably been the highest learning curve of any crop that I've grown. My method for years was simply plant all the transplants at once, hope they don't bolt, freeze or dehydrate the ones that do bolt, and cure the ones that make it to harvest, and then hope that they last a long time in storage, which seems like they never do. They usually only last a couple of months. Now, obviously this has worked well enough. Having frozen onions, dehydrated onions, along with onions that are cured and will last a few months was okay. I really wanted more out of my onion harvest, but I didn't realize what all was possible until last year when I made a mistake that actually didn't turn out to be a mistake, and instead it got me wondering, could there be a better way? Now, you need to know I am a rule follower. Making the decision to test boundaries of some of these rules wasn't made flippantly, but instead, as I hope that you'll see, it came by opening my mind, observing how onions behaved in my conditions, and then learning the why behind the rules. So let's look at 3 areas in which I'm expanding my thoughts on how to grow onions in my location. Now that's the key, because I live in Arkansas, Zone 8A. Our average last frost date is April 8th. We get really hot during the summer. So wherever you grow, you're going to be dealing with different conditions. So while what I'm doing may not be able to be applied exactly to your location, hopefully you can see the why behind what I am going through here so that you can apply the same train of thought in the way that you grow any crop in your garden. So the first rule that I decided to break was to experiment with long day varieties. Now, if you're not familiar with long day, short day, intermediate day onions, this video right here will give you more information on that. But in a nutshell, growing the right variety based on your latitude is essential when it comes to growing onions that actually produce a bulb. For context, I'm at a 35-degree latitude. That's a simple Google search. You can figure out what yours is. And as a beginning gardener, I looked at one map and I thought I had to grow short day onions. Now, as a review, let's just talk about short day, intermediate day, long day, because this is really important when it comes to what I'm sharing with you now. Short day onions are going to start the bulbing process at 10 to 12 hours of daylight. And this is generally suited for those who are between 25 and 35 degrees of latitude. Here at 35 degrees, short day should work for me, but I'm definitely on the edge. Intermediate day onions will start bulbing between 12 and 14 hours of daylight, or if you live between 32 degrees and 42 degrees latitude. Long day onions, which I always thought were off limits for me, don't start bulbing until the day length reaches 14 to 16 hours, depending on the variety. Typically, if you live between 37 and 47 degrees latitude, then you would want to grow long day onions. But if you live in a more southern latitude, because the long day onions take a 14 to 16 hour day to trigger bulb growth, likely you will end up with really beautiful tops of your onions, but not much bulbing. That's why it's essential to make sure that you grow the right day length onion. But a few years into growing onions, I saw a different map and I realized that not only could I grow short day onions, but I could also grow intermediate day onions. Some of these, when I started testing them, they actually seemed to do better and they bolted less. That was a huge revelation for me. So that got me thinking, how long do our days actually get? Can you believe that I've been gardening for 10 years and I did not look this up until last year? I did not pay attention to how long my days here in Arkansas at 35-degree latitude get. But once I did, I was actually pretty amazed. So we pass 14 hours in a day on May 14th, and our longest day is 14 hours and 32 minutes. So it stands to reason some long day onions could grow here. Some are not going to bulb, especially those that don't start bulbing till 16 hours because we never get that long of a day, but maybe some could. And if some could grow here, that would be awesome. Because here's the thing about long day onions. They harvest later in the year and then they store longer. What potential that would be is that not only would I be able to have a later harvest, but I would also be able to store them longer to be able to have them last longer in the winter than I get when I harvest onions in June and they don't store for more than 2 to 3 months. So you can see what kind of potential I was thinking here. Kind of having in my mind that I could never grow long day onions, I didn't even think it was possible until I saw that some friends on Instagram that live just a little bit north of me were growing some specific long day varieties with success. So I thought I'd try. I mean, what would the harm be? At the very least, I wouldn't get onions with bulbs, but as long as I planted some of my tried and true, I knew I'd still get a harvest. So specifically, following their lead, I first tried growing the variety called Patterson. And if you look at the seed catalogs, it says that Patterson grows well at the 38th parallel. Now, I'm at 35, so technically I'm still below this, but not that far south, right? So let's just try it. And after 2 seasons of growing Patterson, they produced decent sized bulbs. Now, they were a little bit smaller than my intermediate day onions, but not by much. And they stored so much longer. I still have some of these onions in my pantry well into March. Now they are starting to get a little bit soft, but still, this is way longer than I've ever been able to have onions in my pantry, because in the past, after harvesting in June and July, they would definitely start going bad into the fall. Another thing that I learned was that smaller onions store better, so bigger isn't always better. It seems like I'm always seeing that my larger ones, you know, the ones that are Instagram worthy, that are the size of a softball, those were actually the ones that got softer quicker. So I realized that a little bit smaller onions, maybe baseball size or a little bit less, might actually work out better for storage. So here I am, a gardener who as a beginner thought that I could only grow short day onions. I'm actually growing all 3. All because I opened my mind, I observed my climate, I listened to local gardeners, and I wasn't afraid to do a little bit of experimenting. Rule number 2 that I broke was to plant intermediate day varieties later. It took me a few years to get out of the mindset that I had to rush to get my onions in the ground. That was because I was planting short day onions, and because bulb initiation begins at 10 to 12 hours of daylight, which for us is between January 13th through March 16th, I had to plant early. Because if I planted too late, they would start to bulb without having enough green growth to support the plant growth. I also always thought, erroneously, now that I think about it, that heat was what caused onions to bolt, because the onions that I was planting tended to bolt more frequently, and usually this corresponded with the rise in temperatures. But now I'm learning that that isn't necessarily the case. It's the weather fluctuations that tend to cause onions to bolt. And what would happen then is I would plant my short day onions really early in the season. One year I planted them in January, and weather definitely fluctuates in February and March, going up into the 80s and then down into the 20s, and it goes up and down like a roller coaster. And with an onion being a biennial plant, which means it produces the bulb and the growth the first year and then produces the seed the second year, it would think that it had passed 2 seasons when the temperatures go up and down. So that is what triggers bolting, not necessarily the heat. If that's the case, then I started learning that I actually have more time to plant intermediate day and long day onions. And when I plant a little bit later, the roller coaster weather can mostly be avoided. Also, when I plant later, I harvest later, and because I harvest later, then these onions are going to store longer. It took that mistake, that accident that I made last year to learn this though. So what ended up happening is I was starting onions from seed last January, but my seeds didn't come in time, and so I didn't get them started until the middle of January, which is really kind of late in my climate to be able to start onion seeds. So my onion plants that I'd started from seed weren't actually ready to go into the garden until later in April, which is 1 to 2 months after I typically plant onions here. But I thought, why not try it? I still had some that I had bought as transplants from Dixondale Farms, and I definitely relied on those. But I thought, let's just plant these other ones anyway, the ones that I started later. Some of them were the long day onions, some were intermediate day, and let's just see what happens. What ended up happening was that these onions actually grew pretty well. They didn't get huge bulbs, but some of them were the long day. But I didn't end up having to harvest them till August or September. So that was a huge win for me, which leads me to the next rule that I guess it's my own rule that I'm breaking. I don't know that I've really heard anybody else talk about this, but the rule that I had for myself that I had to plant all of my onions all at once. Instead, what I'm doing this year, and I'm trying lots of different things just to see what works, is succession planting onions. With succession planting onions, I'm trying to branch out a little bit from the typical gardener's way of growing onions, which is plant once and harvest once. Now, sure, it's nice to have one huge onion harvest, but if most of those onions are only going to store for a few months, then what's the point? Wouldn't it be better to harvest throughout the season if I could? Having fresh onions for longer throughout the season and then being able to store some of those later harvests for longer. So when it came to applying succession planting principles, I thought, why not? If I'm not bound by planting early, maybe I could stagger just a bit. So here's where I branched out even further. Number one, I bought some short day onion transplants from Dixondale Farms in the fall, and I planted them in the fall with the goal of an early onion harvest. As I told you, my onions in my pantry in March are starting to get soft and I'm running out. So if I could get a harvest quicker and not have to wait till June, that would be even better. I had heard about gardeners that are similar to my location actually planting their onion transplants in the fall, but I was always really nervous about that. Even though I'm zone 8A, we got down to 0 degrees, and that's not that uncommon with certain seasons, so I was really nervous that the onions wouldn't last the whole winter. So far, they actually have. The ones that I planted and covered, they're doing great. The ones that I kept in the greenhouse, they're doing great. And surprisingly, the ones that I planted in the garden that I did not cover at all, they are still alive. They're not nearly as large as the ones that I was able to protect, but they're still alive. We'll see how that goes. So the first thing I was doing with the succession is planting in the fall and seeing if I could get an early harvest. The second thing is planting transplants at a normal time. This time I planted in, I think it was late February, early March. We ended up having kind of a warm spell, so I planted in early March. And my goal for these is to have a June and July harvest. The only thing that may change this is that these were ones I started from seed back in December. And even though I had started them from seed in December, they didn't size up to the point that the transplants that I usually buy from Dixondale Farms do. So they may actually harvest a little bit later. We'll see. I am determined to figure out how to successfully start onion seeds indoors and grow them out to full maturity. This is the first year, except for the short day onions I bought in the fall, that I haven't bought any transplants because I'm trying to bank on doing them all from seed. So I had that second planting. And then the final planting is one that I planted later on purpose, and that would be these right here. These I started, I think February maybe, with the purpose of getting these out in late April to have a late summer harvest like I did last year. Basically, last year's mistake and accident had become this year's plan. If you see these right here, these were actually the first ones that I started back in December, and I planted most of them in my garden, but when you plant too many and you have some left over, you can't really, I couldn't throw them out. So I'm still growing these. I may just try to put them somewhere and see what happens. But you can kind of tell the difference here between the ones that I started in December and the ones that I started, it may have been late January, I can't recall. But that was kind of my whole point with the succession planting of those three. As you can see, all of this is still a work in progress, but it took understanding the onion's growth habit and also a willingness to question the rules. Now, rules are there to guide beginners, and they are very helpful. If I didn't understand the rules of short day, intermediate day, long day, understanding that the day length really mattered when it came to bulb formation, then I could have planted the entire wrong onion and not gotten a bulb at all. So yes, those rules are very helpful. But once you start to grow and get experience and observe, why not test a few things? Why not test what you can do now that you have some informed logic from your own experience? You'll never know unless you try. And that's why I love to encourage you, as you get experience, to test breaking some of the rules and see what works best for you. We are all gardening in different areas, in different climates, in different contexts, and what works for one person may not work for another, but what doesn't work for someone else might actually be the key to your success. Now, as you're watching this, I'm still in the middle of this succession planting experiment, so make sure you're subscribed when I update as the season goes on.